is sending a clear signal on COVID. The emergency has ended. As of April 10th, it is no longer a national emergency. And another major piece, the public health emergency, will sunset on May 11th. So if politicians decide it's over, surely they made certain that America learned as much as it could from the COVID response, right? Wrong. Congress failed to pass legislation that would establish a commission to study what happened, but into that void stepped private foundations, and the COVID Crisis Group was born. After 2 years of work, its report was published this week in a book titled Lessons from the COVID War, an investigative report. Philip Zelikow headed the group just as he did the 9/11 Commission. He joins me now. Philip, pleasure to have you on.
Great to be here, Fareed.
First, why do you think, contrast to the 9/11 Commission, there really was no appetite on either side of the aisle to look at? I mean, here we have this massive pandemic, over 1 million Americans died, and nobody seems to want to ask, did we handle it well?
Well, part of what happened is each side had its blame story. So on the Republican side, it's blame China, blame Tony Fauci. On the Democratic side, it's blame Trump. And since each side kind of had their political narrative, they didn't really want to complexify that. So there wasn't as much of a partisan push for it. In the administration, there was at first a reluctance to be distracted by an investigation. Then they realized the investigation would investigate them too. But the bottom line is, I think people didn't want a commission because they didn't realize what a commission could tell them. They didn't realize what a commission could help them do because they themselves internally didn't really understand what happened and how to fix it. So they didn't have a vision of how to use the commission to do that fix.
So what to you is the central lesson that comes out of the COVID war?
The central lesson is preparedness, and what preparedness really means. Preparedness is not kind of, well, you should protect people or you should protect the economy. Those are abstractions. Preparedness is, okay, what do we actually do? And if we're confronted with a giant emergency, what do we do? And then when you think about that a while, okay, then we have to know what to do, not what should be done abstractly, but what exactly to do. We have to train people to do it. We have to have the capacity and equipment to do it. And you have to make those preparations in advance. So what happens in the crisis is really fairly quickly, folks really didn't know what to do. And the public could kind of tell that people were flailing. And into that void of people flailing and not really knowing what to do or being ready, inflows the toxic politics.
And, you know, it seems to me that what you're describing is a particularly difficult test for America because a public health emergency, unlike a national security emergency, is one where it's not just the federal government that has to act. It's the federal government in coordination with the state governments, in coordination with local governments. There were thousands of public health authorities within the U.S., and this is something we are very bad at.
And this is a big point that's in our report, and the private sector and private firms. The government in peacetime just doesn't have the capacity to do stuff, so you have to partner with the private sector. Take the example of tests. Everyone remembers that there was a big testing fiasco in 2020. So we didn't design a very good test. But even if we had designed a very good test, we hadn't prepared with the private sector to make millions of them. Even if we had prepared with the private sector to make millions of them, we didn't have any plan of what to do with the tests. Exactly how should we use them? Should we use them to protect nursing homes, to reopen schools, to have 10,000 drive-through sites for anxious citizens, to do biomedical surveillance? Then you'd have to coordinate that nationally. See, that's what we mean about preparedness. It's kind of this unglamorous stuff that actually isn't really a partisan story. The main function of our report is when you go through it, you say, oh, I see. What it is we needed to do, and then we weren't ready to do those things.
What should we have done with schools? Because it seems to me that in retrospect, that might have been one of the biggest errors.
Yeah, and
closing the schools was a bad idea.
Yeah, one of the interesting things in the report is we actually compare America's school closures with school closures in other affluent countries around the world. I think a lot of your viewers may not realize that America closed its schools about twice as much as they did in places like Germany or Israel. Well, why did they get their schools open much more? It's because they figured out the toolkits to how to reopen the schools, and then they applied those toolkits with policies. See, the whole goal of public health is not to lock people in. It's to help people go about their daily lives and feel safe. So the whole idea is, how do you reopen schools? What's practical? For example, in the case, we could have, I think, and our report says, we could have started reopening schools in a big way by the fall of 2020 if we had perfected toolkits about things like ventilation, understanding that good air circulation really diminishes the risk of disease, combined with things like high quality masking, smaller classrooms. There are a lot of tools we could have used to make it safe to go back to school and make teachers feel safe. In the absence of those tools, basically people crouch and you're paralyzed, and then you stay away and your schools end up staying closed a school year longer than was the case in much of the developed world.
And we have so far learned really none of the important lessons.
Sadly, because folks don't really understand truly why things went so wrong. They haven't really done anything fundamental to fix it, and we're as vulnerable to a pandemic today as we were at the beginning of 2020.
Wow. A very important book to read. Philip Zelikow, pleasure to have you on.
Thank you, Fareed.
And we will be back.